My name is Walt, and I've spent a long time listening to stories about men who lost everything. Some of those men got back up, built something new from whatever was left, found a way to carry what mattered and let the rest go. I've known men like that, not many, but enough to know they exist. Enough to know that the getting back up is real, and not just something people say to make themselves feel better about the world. I've also known the other kind, men who took the hit and never recovered. Not because they lack strength, some of the strongest men I've ever met never got back up, but because the thing they lost wasn't just a job or a house or a marriage. It was the thing that told them who they were when they looked in the mirror every morning. Lose that and you don't just lose ground, you lose the map. And a man without a map doesn't stop moving. He just stops knowing where he's going, and after a while, the moving itself starts to feel like the problem. Cole Vander was somewhere between those two kinds of men when I first heard about him. Not broken, not rebuilt, just moving, quiet, following signals the way a man does when he's got nothing left to lose and nowhere particular to be. Not reckless, not defeated, just present in that particular stripped down way that comes when everything extra has been taken away and what's left is only the man himself. He walked into a county office in Grants Pass, Oregon on a Tuesday morning in late October and bought a shuttered gas station for $3 in back taxes. The clerk asked him twice if he understood what he was signing. He said yes both times. She stamped the deed and handed it across the counter, and that was that. $3. His name on a property that nobody had wanted for 11 years. A piece of land on a road that most people had stopped using when the interstate went in. A building that had been closed longer than some of the people working in that county office had been alive. He drove out to the station that same afternoon. I want to tell you what kind of man Cole was before I tell you what he found. Because the finding only makes sense if you understand the man who did the finding. And Cole Vander is not the kind of man whose story starts the day something good happened to him. His story starts much earlier than that. It starts with 19 years of something that most people on the outside never fully understand, and it ends with a vote he didn't see coming until it was already over. Cole was 31 years old when he patched into the Iron Saints. This was not a decision he made lightly or impulsively. He had been riding since he was 17, had known members of the chapter for years before he was ever considered, and had spent 18 months as a prospect, doing every unglamorous, thankless thing the club required before anyone offered him a vote. Carrying gear, running errands at hours that weren't convenient, showing up when he was told to show up, and staying out of conversations he hadn't been invited into. He did all of it without complaint and without impatience, which is itself a form of character test. The club was watching how he handled the waiting as much as how he handled anything else. I understood what he was choosing. He chose it fully. 19 years is a long time to belong to anything. Long enough that the belonging stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a fact, like the color of your eyes or the sound of your own name. You stop thinking about it the way you stop thinking about breathing. Not because it has become unimportant, but because it has become so fundamental that removing it from conscious attention is the only way to actually function. Cole wasn't in the Iron Saints the way some men are in a club, showing up for the runs and the rallies, and disappearing when things got complicated. He was the man you called at 2 in the morning when a brother's bike broke down 3 states from home. He was the man who showed up, no questions, no complaints, who remembered every detail of every situation, so he never had to be told the same thing twice. He was the kind of member who holds a chapter together from the inside without ever needing anyone to say so out loud. The kind whose value only becomes fully visible after he's gone because he was doing things nobody noticed until they stopped getting done. Han lost that on a Wednesday in March. It wasn't one thing. That's important to understand. It never is. The unraveling was slow the way serious things usually are. A tension inside the chapter that had been building for longer than anyone wanted to admit. A conflict that had started as a disagreement between two men and grown over 18 months into something that divided the room every time it came up. Not loudly. The serious divisions in close communities rarely happen loudly. They happen in the silences between words, in the way men stop meeting each other's eyes, in the accumulation of small moments that nobody addresses, because addressing them would require acknowledging that something has gone wrong at the root. The short version is this. A situation developed involving someone outside the club, a civilian, a woman whose name Cole won't say and whose details don't belong to this story. What matters is that she was hurt, and that the men responsible were connected to the chapter, and that there was a conversation, more than one conversation, about how to handle it. Cole's position was simple. You don't protect the chapter by doing nothing when someone outside it gets hurt because of something people inside it did. That's not protection. That's rot. You clean it up. You make it right. You face what happened, and you deal with it the way men are supposed to deal with things they've caused. Not for appearances, not because someone is watching, because it's the right thing, and the right thing doesn't stop being the right thing because it's inconvenient. Not everyone agreed. The vote came on a night Cole hadn't been told to prepare for. He sat in that room and heard his name and watched hands go up and understood in the space of about 30 seconds that 19 years of his life had just ended. No appeal, no second vote, no conversation afterward where anyone pulled him aside and said they were sorry, or explained themselves, or offered anything that resembled an acknowledgement of what was being taken. The decision was made and the door closed behind him before he fully understood what had happened. He drove back to his apartment that night and sat in his truck in the parking lot for a long time before he went inside. I didn't fight it. That's the thing about Cole that matters most for understanding everything that came after. He could have made noise, could have caused problems, could have taken what he knew about the chapter, and he knew considerable things about the chapter, and made the people who voted against him regret it in ways that would have been difficult to recover from. He didn't do any of that. He packed what was his, returned what wasn't, and left. Not because he was afraid, not because he'd given up, but because the principle that got him voted out was the same principle that made burning it down on the way out feel like the wrong thing to do. You don't get to compromise the thing you stood for in order to punish the people who punished you for standing for it. That's not how integrity works. Integrity isn't a strategy you deploy when it's convenient. It's either the way you operate or it isn't. And if it is, then it applies to the exit as much as it applies to everything else. He did the right thing when it cost him everything. And then he walked away quietly and carried that cost alone. The money went next. Cole had never been good at saving what wasn't connected to something he believed in. The structure of the club, the sense of purpose, the daily shape of belonging to something larger than himself. Without those things, the practical business of managing money felt like building furniture in a house that wasn't his. He tried, got a job doing mechanical work for a shop in Medford, kept it for 4 months before the owner sold the place and the new management brought in their own people. Got another job doing deliveries for a freight company out of Ashland, kept that one longer. Showed up on time, did the work correctly, gave them no reason to let him go, and no particular reason to keep him either. The work wasn't the problem. The problem was that he was living inside a life that had stopped making sense to him, and no amount of honest labor was going to fix that. You can work yourself tired every day and still lie awake at 3 in the morning because the tiredness is in your body and the emptiness is somewhere else entirely. By the time he ended up in Grants Pass, he was living out of a storage unit on the east side of town. Not dramatically, he had a cot, a space heater, a hot plate, and enough room to keep his tools organized along the back wall. He had been there for 4 months. He wasn't drinking himself to death or making poor decisions or feeling sorry for himself in any way he would have recognized as self-pity. He was just waiting for what he couldn't have said. But Cole Vander had always been the kind of man who followed signals, and the signal he was waiting for hadn't come yet. Until the morning it did. The diner was called Patsy's. It had been on that corner for 40 years, and it looked like it. Formica countertops worn smooth at the places people's elbows had rested for decades. Swivel stools with vinyl seats repaired in 3 different shades of red, because nobody had bothered to match the color exactly, and nobody had complained. A pie case that rotated slowly and squeaked every third revolution with the patient reliability of something that has been doing the same thing for so long, it has stopped noticing. Cole went there 3 mornings a week because the coffee was strong and nobody tried to talk to him, and the food was exactly what it was supposed to be without any pretense about it. I was on his second cup when the man sat down 2 stools over. Late 70s, Cole guessed, small-framed but straight-backed, in the way of a man who has worked with his hands all his life, and whose body has retained the posture of use even as other things have slowed. His name was Hector Aldine, though Cole didn't know that yet. He ordered coffee and eggs without looking at the menu, the order of a man who has been coming to the same place long enough that the menu is a formality, and then he said something to the woman behind the counter about a gas station on Route 62. He said it the way people mention things they assume everyone already knows. Casually, between thoughts, the way you reference a landmark or a piece of local history that is simply part of the shared background of living in a place. Cole wasn't eavesdropping. He was just present in the way a man is present when he has nowhere else to be and no particular reason to tune anything out. He heard the words shuttered and back taxes and county can't move it, and that was enough. He turned slightly on his stool. "Excuse me," he said. "You talking about a property for sale?" Hector Aldine looked at him the way old men look at people who have interrupted them. Not annoyed exactly, just taking a moment to assess whether the interruption is worth engaging with. He appeared to decide that it was. "More like giveaway," he said. "County's been trying to offload it for going on 3 years. Nobody wants it. Route 62 died when the interstate went in. Station's been closed 11 years. They just want it off the books." Cole asked how much. Hector told him. $3 in back taxes, maybe less depending on how motivated the clerk was feeling that morning. Cole drank the rest of his coffee, left $4 on the counter, went out to his truck and drove to the county office. Now here is the thing about that moment that I've thought about more than almost any other detail in this story. A man who had lost everything, his identity, his community, his savings, his sense of direction, heard a stranger mention a worthless piece of property at a diner counter, and within 2 hours had signed his name to the deed. No research, no consultation, no deliberation beyond the drive across town. There's research on this, not the kind that makes headlines, but the kind that quietly accumulates in academic journals over decades and eventually changes the way serious people understand human behavior. Northwestern University looked at decision-making in men who had experienced what the researchers called identity collapse, the loss of a role so central to a man's sense of self that its removal produces something clinically indistinguishable from grief. What they found was that these men don't stop moving. They move differently. They become acutely sensitive to signals that other people don't register as signals at all. A word overheard at a counter, a road they've never taken, a door that has no business being open but is. The signal doesn't have to be loud. It just has to arrive when the frequency is right. Cole wasn't being reckless. He was being precisely, almost biologically responsive to the only signal that had come his way in months. He drove out to the station that same afternoon, the deed folded in his shirt pocket, the address written on the back of a gas receipt. Route 62 was exactly what Hector had suggested, a two-lane road that had once been the main corridor through that part of southern Oregon and had slowly become a road that people used only when they had specific reason to. The interstate had pulled the traffic away 20 years ago, and the businesses along Route 62 had followed one by one until what was left was a string of empty buildings and a stretch of asphalt that the county maintained out of obligation rather than necessity. The kind of road that maps still show, but that the world has quietly decided to root around. The station appeared on the left side of the road about 6 miles past the edge of town. Cole pulled off the pavement and rolled to a stop in the gravel lot and sat in his truck for a moment before getting out. He looked at it through the windshield, the way you look at something when you want the first impression to be accurate rather than reactive. The place looked like 11 years of closed. There was no other way to describe it. The pump islands were still standing, but the pumps themselves had been stripped down to their housings. Nothing left worth taking but the metal frames, which weren't worth taking either. Two of the four windows on the front of the building were boarded with plywood that had gone gray and soft at the edges from years of weather. The other two were intact but filmed over with 11 years of road dust and pollen and the particular opacity that comes from glass that has not been touched in a very long time. The canopy above the pump islands listed slightly to the right one of its support columns, having settled deeper into the ground than the others. The sign above the canopy had once had 4 letters and now had 2, and nobody had bothered to take the remaining 2 down. They just hung there partial and patient, waiting for something. Cole got out of the truck and walked the perimeter before he went inside. This was habit, something the club had instilled in him years ago through a kind of osmosis rather than explicit instruction. The accumulated practice of men who understood that situational awareness is a discipline and not a reflex. You walk the outside before you go in. You know what you're entering before you enter it. What he found on the outside matched what he expected. Neglect. Time. 11 years of weather working on a building that nobody was maintaining. Nothing surprising. Nothing that contradicted the story the exterior was telling. What he found on the inside did not match the outside at all. The front of the station, the old retail area, the cashier's counter, the space where snacks and motor oil and the other small necessities of road travel had once been sold, was empty in the expected way. Shelving, stripped floor, dirty ceiling tiles, water stained in the corner above the door. Nothing out of the ordinary. The ordinary abandonment of a commercial space that has been vacated and left. But Cole didn't stop at the front. He moved through to the garage bay. The door to the bay was locked. A standard padlock, nothing unusual. Cole didn't have a key and didn't try to force it. He moved to the window beside it instead and looked through the dust and grime at the space inside. The bay was clean. Not recently cleaned, not spotless, but deliberately maintained in a way that was unmistakable once you were looking for it. The tools on the back wall were hanging in order, each one outlined in black marker on the pegboard behind it, so you could see at a glance whether anything was missing. Not a casual arrangement, a system. The kind of system a man builds when he has thought seriously about how a workspace should function and has implemented his conclusions with care. The workbench along the right wall had been wiped down. The floor had been swept not with the thoroughness of someone preparing for an inspection, but with the thoroughness of someone who intended the cleanliness to last. Someone who swept not for show, but because a clean floor is a functional floor, and a functional floor is a matter of professional respect for the work done on it. Cole stood at that window for a long time. Then he moved to the back of the building and found the door to the small back room that most stations of this era had, the room where the owner or the mechanic spent the hours between customers. Reading, doing paperwork, drinking coffee and watching the road through a window that faced the pump islands. The door was unlocked. He pushed it open. The cot against the far wall still had a blanket folded at the foot of it. The fold was deliberate, square corners. The kind of fold that takes a moment of intention and is the difference between tidying and maintaining. On the small shelf above the cot, a coffee mug that had been rinsed and turned upside down to dry 11 years ago probably, but rinsed and turned down nonetheless, as though whoever left it expected to come back and use it again. This was not a place that had been abandoned. This was a place that had been left, intentionally, carefully, by someone who expected it to be found in the condition they were leaving it in. Someone who had thought about the person who would eventually come through the door and had decided that person deserved to arrive at something that had been maintained rather than surrendered to decay. Cole understood that distinction without being able to articulate it. There is a difference between a man who walks out on something and a man who closes it down properly and steps away. The second kind of leaving requires something the first kind doesn't. It requires that you believe the thing you're leaving still has value even after you're gone, that you care for it to the standard it deserves, even when you're the only one who will ever know whether you did or not, even when there's no audience, even when the caring costs you something and provides nothing in return except the knowledge that you did it right. Whoever had run this station had been that second kind of man. Cole drove back to the county office and signed the paperwork 4 days later. $3. His name on the deed to a shuttered gas station on a road most people had stopped using. He moved his cot and his space heater and his tools out of the storage unit the following week and set them up in Dutch Calhoun's back room, though he didn't know Dutch Calhoun's name yet. I didn't have a plan, not a real one. Something with the garage, maybe. Get the electricity reconnected. Figure out which tools were salvageable and which had gone too far to be worth restoring. See if the structure was sound enough to be used as a working space. Not a gas station that was finished, and he knew it. The infrastructure for fuel sales was gone, and the traffic that had once supported it was gone, and there was no version of this property that made sense as a gas station anymore. But a garage. Somewhere he could work. Somewhere that was his. The tank was not part of the plan. On his third day at the station, Cole was moving old inventory shelving out of the storage room. Heavy metal commercial shelving that had been left when the retail side closed still bolted to the wall in two places when he noticed the numbers. They weren't painted. They were engraved, pressed into the drywall with something sharp and narrow, a nail or a scribe or the point of a compass. Low on the baseboard, right at floor level, in the space that had been completely hidden behind the shelving for what looked like many years, based on the dust accumulation and the undisturbed patina of age on the wall around them. 11 digits, grouped in a way that didn't match any inventory code or equipment serial number Cole had ever encountered. Not a phone number, the grouping was wrong. Not a date, not a product reference. Something else. He crouched down and looked at them for a long moment. Then he took out his phone and photographed them. Then he stood up and kept moving. He told himself it was probably a reference number of some kind. Something the previous owner had noted for reasons that no longer had any relevance. Storage codes for a supplier who no longer existed. A phone number from a different era with a different exchange format. He told himself this for the rest of the afternoon, and he almost believed it, which is different from believing it. It was the cover plate in the floor of the garage bay that stopped him cold. I had access to the bay. By then he'd found a keyring on a hook in the back room and worked through the keys methodically until he found the one that fit the padlock on the bay door. The bay was everything the window view had suggested: functional, organized, maintained. The pegboard, the clean floor, the wiped-down workbench, all of it confirming the impression from outside that this was a space someone had cared for. But it was the floor he was looking at now. Specifically, the cover plate in the center of the bay floor, set back toward the rear wall where the vehicles would have been positioned for service. Every gas station built before a certain era has underground storage tanks. That's not unusual. The EPA regulations that changed how petroleum storage was handled were decades away when most of these stations were constructed and underground. And underground fuel storage was simply the standard. Cole had worked in enough old garages to know what a standard tank access cover looked like. Steel plate flush with the concrete floor, simple bolt mechanism. Functional. Nothing more than what it needed to be. This cover had something extra. A secondary locking mechanism had been welded to the plate. External. Added after the original installation, you could see this clearly if you knew what to look for. The weld marks were visible where newer metal met older metal, the seam between them, the color of something added rather than original. The lock itself was a surplus military mechanism, the kind that had been manufactured in the 1970s for use on storage boxes in environments where the contents were considered too important for civilian hardware. Heavy gauge steel, precision tolerances. The kind of lock designed by people who understood that the difference between adequate security and actual security was the gap between a determined amateur and a prepared professional. Cole recognized it because he had seen one before years ago, in circumstances he has never discussed with anyone and has no intention of discussing now. He stood over that cover plate for a long time. He told himself it was probably old equipment, tools that the previous owner had locked away for insurance reasons and then forgotten about when the station closed. Fuel testing equipment, maybe. Something with liability implications that had been secured and never dealt with. He told himself this convincingly enough that he was able to go back to what he was doing. For 4 days. 4 days of moving through the renovation work, clearing, assessing, making lists, driving to the hardware store, returning with materials while in the background without his full permission. His mind kept returning to the same set of details: the military lock on the floor, the 11-digit sequence on the baseboard, the pegboard with its carefully outlined tools, the folded blanket, the rinsed coffee mug turned upside down to dry. These things kept assembling themselves into a picture that was more coherent than he wanted it to be, more suggestive of deliberate intent than he was ready to follow to its conclusion. He drove to 3 different hardware stores across 2 counties before he found the tools he needed: a specialty drill bit designed for hardened steel, a bypass mechanism he remembered from a situation in a different decade, in a place he doesn't name, that had required him to develop a working knowledge of military surplus hardware that most civilians have no occasion to acquire. He brought what he needed back to the station on a Thursday evening and set up a work light and got down on his knees on the concrete floor of the bay and began. The lock gave after an hour and 40 minutes of careful, methodical work. Not forced, bypassed. The mechanism released with a precision that suggested it had been maintained lightly oiled, kept in working order, which added another layer to the question of what Cole was about to find. He lifted the cover plate and set it aside. He repositioned the work light and looked down into the opening. What came up from below was not what he expected. No fuel smell, no chemical burn, no rot or dampness or the organic decay that comes when moisture gets into a sealed space and stays there. What came up was dry air, still and dry the way the air is in a sealed room that has not been disturbed in a very long time. Like opening a door that has been closed for decades and finding the atmosphere inside preserved, not just unchanged, but intentionally maintained, as though someone had thought carefully about what would happen to this air over time and had engineered against deterioration. Cole lowered himself down. The tank had been modified, substantially, professionally. The petroleum storage portion had been sectioned off with a sealed partition, reduced to a small fraction of the original tank capacity, enough to maintain a technical designation as a fuel storage facility for regulatory purposes. Cole guessed, but not the operational heart of the space anymore. The larger portion of the tank had been converted into a dry storage room. The work was not amateur. The sealing was correct. The moisture barriers were properly installed. The ventilation modifications that kept the air from going stale had been thought through carefully and implemented with precision. This was the work of someone who understood what they were doing, had taken the time to do it right, and had done it with the intention that it should last for a very long time. 4 military surplus ammunition cans sat on a wooden pallet on the floor of the dry space, stacked in pairs, secured with nylon strapping that had retained its tension through however many years the space had been sealed. Cole looked at them for a moment, crouched in the low light at the bottom of a tank that had been converted into something it was never designed to be. Then he unclipped the strapping on the top can and opened it. Cash, bundled in rubber bands, each bundle wrapped in wax paper as protection against any moisture that might eventually find its way through the barriers above. Organized by denomination with the precision of a man who understood that organization is itself a form of respect for whatever is being organized. 50s and hundreds, mostly with a few bundles of 20s. Cole didn't count it. He closed the first can and opened the second. More cash, and beneath the cash, lying flat against the bottom of the can, a ledger. It was a composition notebook, the kind that has been sold at every drugstore in America for decades. Black marbled cover, sewn binding, no label on the front. Cole opened it and looked at the first page. A date that was more than 4 decades old. A name, a dollar amount. And next to the name, written in the right-hand column in handwriting that was careful and unhurried, a single word: rent. He turned the page. Another date, another name, another amount. Medical. He turned more pages. Lawyer, kids, utilities, bail, rent again, medical again, names accumulating, dates advancing, amounts varying from $20 to several hundred. The handwriting shifting across the years, not deteriorating exactly, but changing the way handwriting changes when a man gets older and the hand that holds the pen has done more work than it once had. By the middle years of the book, the letters were formed with slightly more deliberateness, as though the writer was accounting for a minor tremor by being more intentional with each stroke. By the later entries, they were slower still, but legible all the way through. Every entry, every name, every amount. Not a single page skipped, not a single entry abbreviated or rushed. 30 years of entries. Cole sat down on the floor of that tank with his back against the converted partition wall and the ledger open across his knees, and he read. He didn't skim. He didn't flip through looking for the summary. He read every page the way you read something when you understand that every line in it represents a real moment in a real person's life. A night when someone's electricity was about to be cut off and wasn't. A week when someone's kids had food because a man they may never have met had made sure of it. A stretch of months when a woman's rent got paid while her husband was inside, and she was trying to hold together a household that had lost its primary income without warning and without any institutional support that reached far enough to actually help. He read for a long time. The third can held more cash. The fourth held a single item, a sealed envelope. The paper had yellowed at the edges in the way that paper does when it has sat for years in conditions that are controlled but not perfect. A slight browning at the margins, the color of old documents, of things that have been waiting. On the front of the envelope in handwriting that had arrived at the careful and deliberate stage that the later ledger entries showed two words were written. For whoever. Cole looked at those two words for longer than he looked at almost anything else that afternoon. Two words that contained in their deliberate vagueness an entire philosophy. Not a name, not a description, just a recognition that the right person would exist, that they would find their way here, and that the criteria for rightness would be demonstrated by the act of arrival rather than specified in advance. He opened the envelope. The letter inside covered one full page front and back in the same careful handwriting that had grown slower and more deliberate over the decades of the ledger. Whoever finds this is the right person. That's not faith, that's math. Nobody comes looking in a place like this unless they need it as bad as it needs them. My name is Dutch Calhern. I ran this station for 31 years. I'm not going to tell you everything I did here because most of it you'll figure out from the ledger. What I will tell you is that the money in these cans is clean, earned slow, kept for a purpose. The purpose is the station. Get it running again, not for fuel that's done, for people. There are people who used to come here not because they needed gas, but because they needed somewhere to land. Give them that. Whatever's left after that is yours. You earned it by showing up. Dutch Calhern. Cole read it twice, then he sat in that tank for another hour without moving. I was 50 years old. He had 19 years of his life behind a door that had closed without warning and locked from the inside. He had $3 to his name when he signed the deed. He was living in a shuttered gas station on a road nobody used. He had just found sealed beneath the floor of a dead man's garage what appeared to be a decades-long private relief operation, documented in handwritten ledgers and funded with cash that would take him most of an afternoon to count. And beneath all of that, beneath the money and the ledger and the letter and the locked tank was a question that was going to take him much longer to answer. Why him? I didn't know yet about the connection between himself and the man who had written that letter. He didn't know what Dutch Calhern had seen years ago on a road that Cole could barely locate in his memory. He didn't know about the old man who had been driving past this station every few months for 11 years, waiting for exactly this moment, holding a document that Dutch had prepared years before the station ever closed. He didn't know any of that yet. What he knew was this: he was sitting at the bottom of a tank in the dark, holding a letter from a dead man who had trusted him before they had ever spoken. And the feeling in his chest was not fear, and it was not confusion. It was recognition. Like a road he had never driven, but somehow knew the shape of. Like arriving somewhere he had been heading without knowing it. Like something that had been moving toward him for a very long time had finally arrived. And the only question remaining was whether he was the man Dutch Calhern had believed he was. Cole folded the letter carefully. He put it back in the envelope. He climbed out of the tank and stood in the garage bay in the low light of late afternoon. The door opened behind him, the Oregon hills going gold through the gap where the road disappeared around the curve. He stood there for a while. Then he went inside, made coffee on the hot plate, and started counting. The money took 4 hours to count. Cole did it twice, not because he didn't trust his own arithmetic, but because the number he arrived at the first time was the kind of number that requires confirmation before you proceed as though it's real. He stacked the bundles on the workbench, organized by denomination, the way Dutch had organized them, and went through every bundle twice. When he arrived at the same number both times, he sat back on his stool and looked at what was in front of him without saying anything to anyone, because there was no one there to say anything to. I didn't sleep much that night, not from excitement. Cole Vander was not a man who got excited easily, and what he was feeling wasn't excitement anyway. It was something closer to weight. The particular weight of understanding that something has been placed in your hands that is larger than you initially understood, and that the question of what you do with it is not going to resolve itself quickly or cleanly or without demanding something real from you. He lay on his cot in the back room with the ledger on the shelf above him and the letter folded in his shirt pocket, and he looked at the water stain on the ceiling, and he thought about Dutch Calhern. I thought about a man who had run a gas station on a road nobody used and had spent 30 years quietly making sure that the families of men who went to prison or got hurt or fell through the cracks had enough to get by. No organization, no board, no tax exemption, no press release or annual report or recognition of any kind. Just a composition notebook and a set of cans in the dark, and a system that ran entirely on the trust of one man who never needed anyone to know his name in connection with what he was doing. Cole had known men who did good things for recognition. He had known men who did good things out of guilt. He had known men who did good things because they had calculated, consciously or not, that the social return on visible generosity was worth the cost of the generosity. He had known men who helped when the helping was easy and the help was visible and someone was watching them help. He had known very few men who did the right thing because the thing needed to be done, and that was the end of the calculation. Dutch Calhern appeared to have been one of those few. The ledger made that clear. 30 years of entries, none of them for show, all of them private, all of them documented not for an audience but for accuracy. Because a man who keeps a ledger for 30 years in a sealed tank underground is not keeping records for anyone else. He's keeping them because records are how you respect what you're doing. Because writing it down is how you say this happened and it was real and it mattered. In the morning, Cole made coffee and took it outside and sat on the concrete step at the side door of the garage and watched the light come up over the hills. Route 62 was quiet in the early morning. It was almost always quiet now. An occasional truck running early freight, a few cars in the first commute hour, but mostly just the road and the hills and the sound of the wind moving through the dry grass on the slope above the station, and the particular silence of a place that has been overlooked for long enough that the world has stopped sending noise its way. He took the ledger outside with him and read it again from the beginning in the morning light. Slowly this time with the urgency of initial discovery, replaced by the attention of a man who already knows what the ledger contains and is now reading it for what it reveals rather than what it reports. The earliest entries were from more than 4 decades back. The handwriting on those early pages was firm and unhurried, the handwriting of a man in his 30s who had not yet developed the compensatory deliberateness that age would eventually require. The amounts were smaller then, $30 here, $50 there, a month's rent, a utility bill, a lawyer's initial retainer for a man who couldn't make bail and whose family couldn't either. But even in those earliest entries, the right-hand column was precise. Dutch Calhern did not write helped out or assisted or gave what I could. He wrote exactly what the money was for, every time for 30 years. Because vague documentation is the documentation of a man who isn't sure he's doing the right thing and is protecting himself from accountability. Precise documentation is the documentation of a man who is certain and wants a record of the certainty. The names spanned 4 decades. Cole could see, reading carefully, how the network had grown from a small geography to something considerably larger. The early entries were all within a county or two of the station. By the middle years, they spread across 3 states. By the later entries, 4. Not because Dutch had gone looking for people to help across a wider territory. Because word moves in certain communities the way useful things move, not through advertising or announcement, but through the accumulated testimony of people who received something real and told someone they trusted, who told someone else until the name and the address had traveled further than Dutch could have anticipated when he started. Cole read all of it, every page, in the morning light with his coffee going cold in his hand and the hills changing color as the sun came higher. Then he closed the ledger and went back inside and began making the list of what the garage needed. He worked for 3 days alone before Cal Morrow showed up. Cole heard the truck before he saw it. An old diesel with the exhaust note of a vehicle maintained by habit and familiarity rather than by any recent professional attention. The note of an engine that runs because it has always run and because the man driving it knows its particular language well enough to hear problems before they become failures. It came down Route 62 slowly and pulled off the pavement and rolled to a stop in the gravel lot with the deceleration of a driver who was not entirely certain the ground would hold. Nobody got out for almost 2 minutes. Cole was in the garage bay working on the electrical panel. He heard the truck registered it kept working. People pulled off Route 62 occasionally out of curiosity. An occupied station on a road with nothing else on it drew attention in the way that any anomaly draws attention, not urgently, but consistently. He had already learned in the first week that some people would sit for a moment and drive on, and he had learned to let them be what they were without making assumptions. But the door of this truck opened after 2 minutes, and Cole heard the particular sound of a man of age getting down from a high cab with deliberate care, and he set down his tools and came to the bay door. The man in the lot was somewhere past 70. Cole put him at 74, which would later turn out to be exactly right. He was wide through the shoulders in the way that comes from decades of physical work and doesn't diminish much even when the work eventually slows a structural width built into the skeleton as much as the muscle. He moved with the economy of a man who has learned through long experience exactly how much energy any situation requires and has stopped spending more than that on anything. He wore work pants and a canvas jacket. He had the particular stillness of someone who stopped needing to announce himself a long time ago. He stood at the entrance to the bay and looked at Cole. Cole looked back. Neither of them spoke for a moment that stretched a beat longer than was comfortable. "You opened it," the man said. It was not a question. "I opened it," Cole said. The man nodded once, the slow descending nod of someone releasing a weight they have been carrying for a long time. Then he came inside. His name was Cal Morrow. He had worked at this station for 22 years, arriving when Dutch Calhoun was already in his mid-50s and staying until the morning. Dutch locked the front door for the last time and told him to go home and not come back. Cal had been the only full-time employee the station ever had across its 31 years of operation. He had pumped gas in the early years, moved into mechanical work as the garage side of the business developed, and in the later years had simply done whatever needed doing. The job description of a man who has been somewhere long enough to understand it completely, whose knowledge of a place has become indistinguishable from the place itself. He sat down on the stool in the corner of the bay and looked at the space around him before he said anything more, taking it in, checking it against a memory that was more than a decade old. "I drove past here," he said finally. "Every few months, 11 years. Cole waited, didn't come in. He told me not to, but I drove past. Cole said Dutch. Cal looked at him. "Dutch Calhoun. Ran this place 31 years. Best man I ever worked for." He paused. "Possibly the best man I ever knew, and I've known some good ones." Cole let the silence after that be what it was. He had spent 19 years in an organization that understood the value of silence between men. Some things don't move faster when you push them. Some things are better for the time they're given. Then Cal looked at Cole directly. The assessment of a man who has spent a long life reading people and trusts the reading, measuring what he saw against a standard he had been carrying for a while. "He talked about you," Cal said. Cole went still. "Didn't know your name. Knew of you. Said he'd seen you once years back, on a road. Said you were the kind of man who did the right thing even when it cost you. Said he'd been watching since then to see if that held. Cole didn't answer. Cal looked around the bay again. At the tools on the pegboard, the clean floor of the work Cole had already started on the electrical panel. Something in the old man's posture shifted, the small controlled shift of someone whose hope has been confirmed rather than disappointed. Apparently it did, Cal said. Hold, he stayed for 3 hours that first day. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. What Cal carried in his memory was 30 years of Dutch Calhern that no ledger could document. The ledger held the transactions. Cal held the texture. The phone calls at midnight when a family was in crisis and Dutch was the only number they had. The drives he had made to courthouses in 3 different states when someone needed a human being to show up in person and there was nobody else. The men Dutch had quietly bailed out and never mentioned afterward, not even to Cal, though Cal had learned to recognize the pattern. The way Dutch would be gone for a day or two, without explanation returning quieter than he had left. The way the ledger entries for those periods would reflect something that had clearly required more than money, more than a phone call, more than paperwork. Just a man showing up somewhere and being present for however long it took. Dutch had never wanted acknowledgement for any of it. Cal said he used to tell him that credit was for people who needed to be seen, that needing to be seen and needing to be useful were different orientations entirely, and that a man who confused them would eventually compromise one for the sake of the other. Dutch had always known which one he was. On the fourth day of Cal's visits, a silver sedan pulled into the lot. Cole saw it through the bay window. A newer vehicle, not from around here, the kind of rental-neutral car that belongs to airports and corporate travel accounts, carrying no regional identity. The man who got out was in his mid-40s, dressed with the considered care of someone who had thought about how they wanted to be perceived in this particular meeting. He carried a leather briefcase with the deliberate grip of someone who wanted you to register the briefcase as a symbol of the authority behind it. Cole came out of the bay and met him in the lot. The man's name was Pruitt. He was an attorney. He represented the estate interests of a distant relative of Dutch Calhern, a nephew of some degree. Cal would confirm afterward, a man who had not spoken to Dutch in over 20 years and had shown no interest in the station or Dutch's life until word reached him through whatever channels such information travels that the property had changed hands and that there might be assets on the premises worth examining. Pruitt was polished in the way of someone who has delivered difficult news and complicated positions many times and has refined the delivery into something that reads as professional empathy over a frame of absolute strategic intent. He laid out his position methodically. He had documentation suggesting that personal property belonging to Dutch Calhern's estate might have remained on the premises at the time of the property's transfer. He had language about the legal distinction between real property and personal property in estate law. He had a considered position about what rights the estate of Dutch Calhern might reasonably assert regarding contents found on the site after sale. Cole listened to all of it without changing his expression. When Pruitt finished, Cole said, "Give me 2 days." Pruitt looked at him with the slight recalibration of someone who expected a different response, either compliance or confrontation, and had prepared for both. The calm request for time was something he hadn't fully anticipated. He agreed to 2 days, left his card, and drove back down Route 62. Cole watched the silver car until it was gone. Then he went inside and sat at the workbench with the ledger in front of him. I understood what was actually at stake, not abstractly with full and specific clarity. Everything Dutch had built across 30 years was in those cans. The money was the mechanism. The ledger was the record. Dutch's letter was the intent. And Dutch's intent, stated clearly and without equivocation, was that this place be restored and used for the people who needed somewhere to land. A lawyer representing a nephew who hadn't spoken to Dutch in 2 decades was not going to redirect that toward a legal settlement. Not if Cole could prevent it. And Cole was at this particular moment motivated to prevent it with a focus that surprised him somewhat. given that 3 weeks earlier he had owned nothing and expected nothing. I was not fighting for himself. That was the thing he kept coming back to. He had not thought of the money as his from the moment he read the letter. He was fighting for Dutch, for the 30 years of work in that ledger, for the families whose names were in those pages and who might still be reached, for the completion of something that deserved to be completed. He called Cal that evening. Cal arrived the next morning with a cardboard box under his arm. He set it on the workbench without comment and began going through it methodically. Old receipts, correspondence from suppliers and county offices going back decades, equipment records, and at the bottom of the box in a manila envelope that Cal had kept in a fireproof lockbox in his house for 14 years, kept without being entirely certain why, only certain that Dutch had told him to keep it, and that Dutch's instructions on such matters had always turned out to be correct, a single document. It was a notarized letter. Dutch Calhern's signature at the bottom with the characteristic slower handwriting of the later years. Dated 3 years before the station closed, which placed it 14 years before this morning. 4 additional signatures below Dutch's and a notary stamp dated and officially filed with the county clerk's office in Jackson County, Oregon. Cole read it. The document addressed in precise and legally considered language the disposition of any contents found in the underground storage of the property in the event of a sale or transfer of the real estate. It named no individual recipient. It named a purpose. The contents the document stated were to be used for the restoration and continued operation of this property as a community resource in accordance with the intent of the owner as established by 31 years of operation. Any legal challenge to this disposition was explicitly characterized as a challenge to the expressed and documented intent of the original owner witnessed and notarized below. Cole read it twice. Then he set it on the workbench and looked at Cal. Cal was looking back at him with the expression of a man who has been carrying something valuable for a long time and is relieved finally to have delivered it to the right hands. He told me to keep it, Cal said. Said I'd know when to bring it out. Said if the right person showed up and someone tried to take what they found, I was to produce this document and let it do the talking. Cole looked at the notary stamp. 14 years ago. Dutch had prepared this 3 years before the station closed, which meant that Dutch had known 3 years before he walked away from it that he was building something designed to outlast him and potentially face legal challenge after his death. He had not merely hoped for the best. He had taken the specific, practical, forward-looking step of consulting a notary, gathering 4 witnesses, and filing documentation with the county against a future dispute he correctly anticipated. You held this for 14 years, Cole said. Cal nodded, drove past here every few months, kept the document, waited. Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he told you I was the right person. No, Cal said. He didn't know who it would be. He just told me I'd know when I saw them. Cole made 2 photocopies of the document on the small copier in the back room. Logged both copies in a notebook with the date and time and a description of the document. Put the original back in Cal's envelope for safekeeping. Pruitt came back on the 3rd day. Cole met him in the lot, handed him a copy of the document without preamble or explanation, stood there while Pruitt read it, watched him read it a second time, watched the careful, controlled adjustment in the man's posture that happens when a legal professional recognizes that the terrain under his position has shifted substantially. We'll be in touch, Pruitt said. He put the document in his briefcase, got in the silver car, drove away down Route 62. They were never in touch. Cole stood in the lot after the car disappeared around the curve and felt something settle in his chest, not triumph. That word was too loud for what it was, something quieter. The specific feeling of confirmation, the first real confirmation since he had climbed down into that tank, that what Dutch had asked of him was something he was genuinely capable of carrying. Cal was standing in the doorway of the bay, watching. Cole turned and looked at him. He knew, Cole said, about the document, about the lawyer. He knew all of this would happen. Cal looked out at the road, then at Cole. He knew a lot of things like that. He thought further ahead than most people bothered to. Cole went back inside. He sat at the workbench with the ledger in front of him and thought about the connection Cal had mentioned. The road, the night, the thing Dutch had seen that Cole apparently hadn't registered as significant enough to remember. He had been turning this over since Cal first mentioned it, and he couldn't locate the specific moment in memory which told him something in itself. Dutch had watched Cole do something right when it cost him something, and Cole hadn't even marked the moment. He had done what seemed like the obvious thing to do and moved on without ceremony. And Dutch, a man Cole had apparently never registered at all. A man Cole could not place. No matter how carefully he searched, Dutch had watched that moment and carried it forward for years, had built an entire contingency around it, had looked at one unremarkable act of integrity on one unremarkable night, and decided that this was a man worth preparing for. Cole sat with that for a long time. He thought about the vote, about the room and the hands going up. He thought about the storage unit in the diner counter in the $3 deed. He thought about climbing down into the dark and finding what Dutch had built, and reading a letter addressed to no one, and recognizing himself in it without being able to say why. And then he thought about this Dutch Calhern had not been lucky in his choice. He had been careful. He had watched and waited and prepared documentation for a future dispute. He correctly anticipated and given Cal specific instructions for a specific scenario. He had done everything a man can do to ensure that the thing he built would survive him and reach the right person. All of that across decades because of one moment on one road that Cole couldn't even find in his memory. He opened the ledger to the last entry, the handwriting at its most deliberate, a name, an amount, the same word in the right-hand column that appeared more than any other word across 30 years of entries: rent. Cole looked at that word for a while. Then he picked up a pen and opened his own notebook to a clean page. He drew 3 columns, same format as Dutch's, same headings. He wrote the date at the top. In the right-hand column where Dutch had written rent and lawyer and medical and kids, Cole paused with the pen resting on the page. Then he wrote a single word. He was not sure in the moment of writing it exactly why that word, and not another. It simply seemed like the only honest word for what he was undertaking. Not a transaction, not a repayment, something with more motion in it than that. He closed the notebook, set down the pen, looked out the window of the back room at the hills above Route 62 going brown in the late season light. I had 437 names in Dutch's ledger. He was going to need the garage operational before he could reach them. He was going to need time. He was going to need to build something sustainable before he could leave it in anyone else's hands. 8 months, he thought, maybe 9. He went back to the electrical panel. Dutch had never made any of the work look like sacrifice, Cal had said. It had simply been what Dutch did. The motion of a man for whom doing useful things was the substance of ordinary life rather than a departure from it. Cole stared at the ceiling that night on the cot in the back room, with the letter in his shirt pocket and the ledger on the shelf and the atlas he had driven to town that evening to buy spread open on the workbench. 7 states, 112 names he might still be able to reach. He had spent 2 years thinking about the vote as the moment everything ended. Lying in the dark in Dutch Calhern's back room, with Dutch Calhern's letter against his chest and Dutch Calhern's ledger on the shelf above his head, he understood for the first time that he had been wrong about that. The vote wasn't the end of anything. It was the last turn on a very long road that had been heading here all along. He turned on his side and closed his eyes and slept better than he had since the vote. 8 months is a long time when you are working alone towards something nobody else can see yet. Cole learned that in the first week of renovation. Not as a discouraging fact, but as a practical one, the way you learn the actual weight of a tool before you learn to use it well. The work was what it was. It would take what it took. Complaining about the terms of something you've chosen is energy that could go into the thing itself, and Cole Vander had never been a man who spent that energy on complaint. He started with the roof, 2 soft spots over the garage bay that needed addressing before any serious work could happen beneath them. He sourced the materials, drove to the lumberyard in Medford, loaded the truck himself, brought it back, and did the work over 4 days in the first week of November. He was not a roofer by trade, but he had worked in and around enough structures to know what sound repairs look like, and he held himself to that standard even when he was the only person who would ever see the underlayment or know whether the ceiling on the second day, which he had done in the rain, because the forecast said the rain would continue for another 4 days, and the soft spots couldn't wait, was done correctly. The electrical panel came next. The original wiring was from an era before the current codes, some of it so far outside current standards that the word outdated didn't quite cover it. Cole pulled it entirely rather than work around it. He hired an electrician from Grants Pass for the panel replacement itself, a woman named Shirley, who arrived on time, assessed the situation without commentary, did the work at the standard it required, and charged a fair price. Cole did the runs to the bay outlets himself. By the end of the third week, he had functional power throughout the building and hot water in the back room for the first time since the station had closed. The bay equipment consumed most of the first phase budget. Two used lifts, both sourced from a shop in Klamath Falls, that was upgrading to newer equipment. Cole drove out there on a Thursday morning and spent 2 hours going over both units before he agreed to the price, not to negotiate but to verify. He wanted to know what he was installing. When the lifts were in and he ran the first test cycle and the mechanism came up clean and level and held precisely where it was supposed to hold, he stood with his hand on the column for a moment before moving on. Han documented everything. Every receipt, every invoice, every supply run entered in a notebook with the date, the amount, and what it was for. Dutch had not specified this. The letter had not required it. But Dutch had kept a ledger for 30 years, and Cole understood by now that the documenting was not about accounting. It was about bearing witness, about a man saying in writing that what he was doing was real and intentional, and that he was prepared to stand behind every decision. Documentation is not clerical work when it's done with that understanding. It's a form of integrity. Cole documented everything with that understanding. The back room he designed around a single question. What does a person need when they arrive somewhere and need to stop for a while? Not comfort in the luxury sense. Functionality in the human sense. A table that could seat 8. 4 chairs to start. A coffee maker, the reliable kind without unnecessary features. The kind that has one job and does it for 20 years without requiring attention. A small bulletin board for the schedule and the work orders. A coat hook by the door, nothing decorative, everything useful. The kind of space that communicates without saying it, that the people who enter it are expected and welcome. On the morning before the garage opened, Cole stood in the finished back room and thought about the words in Dutch's letter. For people who needed somewhere to land. He looked at the table and the chairs and understood that landing doesn't require much. It requires solidity underfoot and a signal that someone has made room. He had made the room. The rest was up to whoever needed it. The garage opened on a Thursday morning in early summer, 8 months and 11 days after Cole had signed the deed at the county clerk's office. He arrived at 6:30, made coffee, opened both bay doors to the morning air, stood in the lot for a moment looking out at Route 62 in the early light. Quiet. Almost always quiet now. I went inside, checked the workboard, and started on the first job. A brake job on a 2009 Ford pickup belonging to a rancher from outside Medford, who had heard about the garage from his neighbor, who had heard about it from someone else in the chain that operates in rural communities through no infrastructure except the human voice and the willingness to pass something useful along when you encounter it. By the end of the first month, the garage was covering its costs. By the end of the third month, it was profitable, not dramatically. The kind of profitable that comes from doing good work at honest prices, without spending money on things that don't contribute to the work. The version that is less interesting than a dramatic turnaround, but far more durable, the version that lasts. Cal came by 2 or 3 times a week. Not always to help, though he helped when something needed extra hands. Mostly just to be present in the way that certain men are present when they have found somewhere that feels like it belongs to them without formally being theirs. He would sit on the stool in the corner of the bay with his coffee and watch Cole work and say something worth saying when he had something worth saying. And Cole found that the presence of a man who had known Dutch for 22 years made the work feel continuous in a way nothing else could have provided. The float fund he established quietly in the third week in a separate notebook kept in the backroom drawer. Same structure as Dutch's system. No applications, no committee, no announced criteria. A reserve of money set aside for people who arrived in genuine need, administered entirely by Cole's judgment, after the conversation each situation required. If someone needed help getting back on their feet and couldn't get it elsewhere, the float covered it. He didn't announce this. He didn't post a sign. Word found the people who needed to know about it, the same way word about the garage itself had traveled, passed person to person by the people who had been helped, who understood, without being told, that receiving something useful came with the quiet obligation to pass it on. I had spent evenings through the renovation months working through Dutch's ledger against current records from the county library. Of the 437 names, 112 were still reachable through some combination of current addresses, family connections, and the kind of community knowledge that persists in rural areas long after official records go cold. The rest were deceased or had moved too many times across too many years to trace with the resources Cole had. He built the route on the Atlas, 7 states, roughly 9,000 miles if he drove it efficiently. Garrett Fenn came on board 6 weeks before Cole left for the road. Garrett was 41 years old and had spent 8 years inside on a conviction he discussed directly and without self-pity when Cole asked which Cole did on the grounds that he wasn't going to hire someone and then spend the next year finding out who they actually were. Garrett had been out for 2 years, had applied to 63 jobs across that time, and had received 0 callbacks. He arrived at the garage on a Tuesday afternoon because someone on the road had told him it was worth trying. Cole hired him after 20 minutes of direct questions and direct answers. No complicated evaluation. Cole had made judgments about men under considerably higher stakes conditions than a conversation in a garage bay, and his record on those judgments was reliable enough that he trusted the process. Garrett was a man who knew how to work, wanted to be given a fair chance to prove it, and didn't waste words. That was enough. 3 months later, Garrett was the most reliable person on the floor. He moved through the work with the particular authority that comes not from assertion, but from competence, from being the person who always knows where the right tool is and what the next step requires and how long the job will actually take, rather than how long it would be convenient for it to take. Before Cole left for the road trip, he told Garrett they would talk about a stake in the operation when he got back. Small, enough to matter. Garrett had looked at him for a moment and said, "Nobody's done that before." Cole said, "I know." Ren Alcott arrived 6 weeks before the road trip on a weekday afternoon, not as a customer, and asked Cole directly whether she could learn how an engine worked. She was 18. Nobody in her immediate world had a background in trades work. Nobody had ever pointed her in the direction her curiosity was clearly and consistently pointing. She had been overlooked in the particular way that young people with practical intelligence get overlooked, not through active discouragement, but through the simple absence of anyone saying the obvious thing out loud. Cole said yes. He enrolled her in a technical certification program at the community college in Medford at the end of her first month. Paid the tuition himself, told her once and told her not to make it a thing. She told everyone immediately. Cole found this significantly less annoying than he expected to. He left on a Monday morning in late summer, driving north into the long light of a Pacific Northwest morning, the Atlas on the seat beside him, the list of names folded in the breast pocket of his jacket, in the same pocket where Dutch's letter had lived since the day he found it. It seemed right that they travel together. The letter that started this, and the list of names that were the point of it. The first name on his list was a woman in Northern California. He found her on the third try at the address. She had moved twice since Dutch's last entry, but the neighbors at the intermediate address knew where she had gone, in the way that neighbors in certain communities track one another across time without needing a reason to. He knocked at mid-afternoon. She came to the door, late 60s hair, mostly gray, the bearing of a woman who had worked hard for a long time and had arrived at a particular undecorated ease with her own life. Cole said, "My name is Cole Vander. I have something for you from a man named Dutch Calhern." It took a while to find the right people. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. He did not give everyone the full account. Some conversations were brief and practical, an envelope, the necessary words, and then leaving. Some were longer, depending on what the person in the doorway seemed to need. Cole had learned over 19 years to read the difference between someone who wanted explanation and someone who just needed the thing delivered, and he adjusted accordingly without making it a production either way. Some people cried. Some stood completely still in the way people stand when something they had given up expecting arrives, and the nervous system needs a moment to catch up with the fact of it. One man in Nevada shook Cole's hand and didn't let go and didn't say anything, and Cole stood there and let him hold on for as long as he needed to. A woman in Idaho looked at the envelope and then looked at Cole and said she didn't take charity from strangers. Cole said it's not charity, it's Dutch Calhoun paying a debt he believed he owed you. You can disagree with him about whether he owed it, but you can't argue with the fact that he thought he did. She took the envelope. The moment that stayed with Cole, the moment he carried back across 9,000 miles and still thought about on the cot. At night was a gravel driveway behind a small property outside Medford, Oregon, in the second week of the trip. A woman who had been in Dutch's ledger more times than almost any other name. Not large amounts, consistent ones spread across a decade of entries that corresponded to a stretch of significant difficulty. Utilities, rent. One medical entry near the beginning that was larger than the others. She came to the door, and Cole said his line, and she looked at him with an expression he had not seen on any other face on the trip. Not surprise, not the overwhelm of something unexpected arriving. Something more settled and more complicated than either of those things. The expression of someone who has been waiting for a long time for confirmation of something they already believed, but couldn't fully let themselves believe. She said I wondered if he'd forgotten us. Cole said he hadn't. She said, I know. I always knew that in the back of my head. But 11 years is a long time to wonder. Cole handed her the envelope. She took it without looking at it. She was looking at him. She said, who are you two? Dutch, Cole said. He left me the station, and the ledger, and a letter. She nodded slowly. Then you're the right person. Cole said that's what he wrote in the letter. She said Dutch was right about people. He always was. He drove back to Grants Pass in early October. 9,240 miles, 7 states, 4 months. Of the 112 names on his starting list, 63 had been reachable. The remaining 49 were deceased or gone beyond what he could find. 63 envelopes delivered. The amount remaining after the distributions, after the renovation costs, after the operational expenses of the garage's first months, went into a separate account he labeled in his own handwriting, the float. The float was not a charity, and Cole was precise about this distinction, not for anyone else's benefit, but for his own, because precision about what a thing is determines how it functions. Dutch had not run a charity. Dutch had run a system built on the understanding that the floors people hit are often less about character than about circumstance, and that a hand extended at exactly the right moment is not generosity in the soft sense, but investment in the strict sense. Investment in the capacity of a community to hold its own people through the passages that institutions and formal structures don't reach. Cole held his system to that understanding. Birchlander came through on a Wednesday in November, 6 weeks after Cole returned. The bike announced itself before it was visible, a touring bike running a knock that suggested a primary chain long past its service interval, communicating its condition in terms that were going to become substantially more expensive if unaddressed. The bike pulled into the lot, and the man who climbed off it was somewhere in his late 50s, road-worn in the specific way of men who spend significant time traveling alone. Not disheveled, just carrying the compacted self-sufficiency of someone long accustomed to solving their own problems with whatever is available. He stood by the bike after dismounting, looking at the garage with the particular attention of a man confirming something he's been told about. Cole came out of the bay. The man said his name was Birch, said he'd heard about the garage from someone in Klamath Falls, said the bike needed work and he didn't have money for it, and he knew that walking in saying so was a long shot, but he'd learned a long time ago that the answer to not asking was always no. Cole walked around the bike once, crouched down and listened to the knock for a moment. Leave it, he said. Come back Thursday. Birch looked at him the way people look when they're waiting for the condition, the qualifier, the catch that turns yes into something more complicated. There was no catch. Come back Thursday, Cole said again. Birch came back Thursday. The bike was done. Cole handed him the keys and did not hand him a bill. Birch stood in the lot with the keys. After a moment, he said, "Why?" Cole thought about it. He thought about Dutch's letter in the ledger and 63 doors across 7 states. He thought about Cal driving past a locked building for 11 years because a man he trusted had told him the right person would come. He thought about the vote in the storage unit and a Tuesday morning at a diner counter and the dry air coming up from the dark. He said, "Someone did it for me once. Keep moving." That was the whole conversation. Birch rode south. Cole went back into the bay. 6 months later, Cal arrived one morning with news that had come through the network, not the kind with a name or infrastructure, just the kind that moves through communities, the way useful information always moves when no one is managing it. A man named Birchlander had started a food pantry out of the garage at his house in a small town near the California border. No paperwork, no nonprofit status, no board of directors, just a man who had been shown something and had understood, without being instructed, that the showing was itself an instruction. Cole was working on a valve cover when Cal told him. He didn't stop working. He nodded once. Cal said Dutch would say the same thing. Cole said, "I know." The unexpected thing. The thing that surprised Cole more than he anticipated was the money coming back. Not from the 63 people he had driven to find. He had asked nothing of them and implied nothing was expected, but from other directions entirely. A woman in Ashland, Oregon, not one of Dutch's names, someone new, someone who had come through the garage in the fall with a transmission problem she couldn't afford and had received help from the float, sent a check in December. $400. In the memo line, 4 words for the next one. No return address. A man from Medford, also not a Dutch name. Someone who had heard about the float through the network and had used it to cover 2 months of rent. During a difficult transition, appeared one afternoon in January with 2 cases of motor oil and a complete set of hand tools still in the manufacturer's packaging. Set them on the workbench, said he didn't need them anymore and thought the garage could use them. Cole logged both, the check, the oil, the tools, the approximate value, the date. Not because anyone required it, because Dutch had logged everything. And Cole understood now that the logging was not bookkeeping, it was witnessing. It was a man saying out loud, even if only to himself, and whatever record he kept, this happened and it mattered, and I was here for it. The wall in the back room came together the way the best things come together, not from a plan, but from an accumulation of intention across months. Cal brought the page from Dutch's ledger, a page from the middle years when the handwriting was at its most settled and the entries were most representative of the system at full operation. Cole had it framed in plain wood. Nothing that drew attention to the frame, the kind of frame that holds something without competing with it. He hung it on the wall beside the table. Through the glass, the right-hand column of 30 years. 6 words in various combinations down the length of the page. Rent, lawyer, medical, kids, utilities, bail. 30 years of human difficulty reduced to 6 words, each one representing not a category, but a specific night, a specific family, a specific moment. When the difference between getting through and not getting through was a man with a ledger and a tank full of cash, and the long, patient discipline of doing what needed to be done without needing anyone to notice. Beside the frame page, Cole pinned a single sheet from his own notebook. Not framed, 2 small nails in the wall the way you pin something when you want it present without making it a monument. Same format as Dutch's page, same 3 columns, same column headings. 1 word different in the right-hand column. The word he had written that evening in the back room while looking out at the hills. The word that had seemed like the only honest word for what he was undertaking. Not a transaction, not a repayment. Something with motion in it. Forward. He had started using it in the third week the garage was open. It was not a condition. He was not telling people they owed a forward obligation that help came with strings or requirements or expectations of return. It was a reminder, to himself as much as to anyone who came through, that the point had never been the money. Dutch hadn't built a fund. Dutch had built a direction. And the direction was the same regardless of the amount in the account or the number of names still outstanding. Keep it moving. Forward. The Sportster had been sitting in the corner of the bay since October when someone who knew Cole had arranged its delivery, a 1987 model that had been sitting in a barn in Josephine County for 6 years, half stripped the engine dark with oil that had not been changed in a long time. Cole had paid $400 for it, which was probably more than it was worth in the condition it arrived in, and had moved it to the corner while he finished more urgent work. He started on it after the road trip in the evenings after the garage closed. An hour here, 2 hours there. No urgency, no deadline. The bike was not a project with a schedule. It was a conversation, the slow, particular conversation between a man and a machine, conducted in the language of mechanical attention, where the machine tells you what it needs if you're willing to listen with your hands rather than your assumptions. The engine had sat long enough that the rebuild required patience more than expertise. Cole had the patience. He cleaned every component before reinstallation and inspected each one against the standard it was designed to meet. He replaced what replacement required and restored what restoration could serve. He sourced parts carefully favoring original specifications over convenient substitutes, not out of any philosophy about authenticity, but out of respect for what the machine had been built to do. Returning something to its original function requires understanding what that function was. 3 months of evenings, on a Thursday morning in January a year, and 3 months after Cole had signed the $3 deed, he rolled the finished Sportster out of the bay and into the lot. Cal was there. He had not been told to be there. He came by that morning the way he came by most mornings now, and he had watched Cole push the bike out and had taken up his position by the garage door with his coffee cup in hand and said nothing. Cole checked the bike over once more where it stood in the lot. Then he started it. The engine turned over on the second kick and settled into an idle that was even and unhurried, the particular sound of a rebuilt engine that has been done correctly. Not the choppy, tentative idle of something still finding itself. Not the artificially smooth idle of something adjusted to sound better than it is. The organic, self-sustaining rhythm of a machine that has been returned to what it was built to be and is now doing it without effort. Cole stood beside it for a moment listening. Then he got on. He sat with the engine running and his hands on the bars in the road ahead of him. Route 62 ran straight and empty into the distance. The hills above the road were winter brown, and the sky was the specific pale blue of January mornings in southern Oregon. Clear and cold and without drama, the kind of sky that makes no promises and keeps all of them. Cal said from the doorway, "How's it feel?" Cole sat with the engine running for a moment before he answered, not searching for words, giving the question the attention it deserved because Cal had earned that. He said like something that was supposed to happen. Cal nodded. He looked at the road, then at Cole, then at the road again. That was the ceremony. No speeches, no formal marking. A man on a rebuilt machine and an old man with a coffee cup in a road going somewhere in the January light. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and the rest was in the sound of the engine in the empty road ahead. By the end of the first year, the garage had served over 400 customers. The float had dispersed just under $31,000 across 68 families in 4 states. Garrett had taken on 2 apprentices of his own younger men who had come through the same door he had come through, sent by someone on the road, arriving without certainty and leaving with a chance. Wren had finished her certification and was running diagnostics that Garrett reported she processed twice as fast as he did, a fact he stated without any apparent investment in how it reflected on him, which Cole found in its own way a reliable measure of character. On an evening in October of the second year, a Thursday early dusk, the first real cold of the season arriving in the air, Something happened that Cole had not organized or announced. 30 people came to the back lot, not formally, not because anyone sent an invitation. Word had moved the way it always moved in that network, not through channels with names, but through the simple, unremarkable transmission of people who knew something worth knowing and told someone who needed to know it. Some of them had been through the garage. Some had received envelopes on the road trip. Some had known Dutch's name for 30 years and had never connected it to this place until recently. Some had never heard of Dutch at all and had simply been told by someone they trusted that this was a place worth showing up for. Someone brought food. Someone brought a generator and a string of lights that they hung between the eave of the garage and a post in the corner of the lot. Garrett had built a low platform from reclaimed lumber in the days before, without being asked, without explaining why, with the quiet prescience of someone who understood what was going to happen before it happened. Cal sat in a chair on that platform and looked at the people standing in the lot and was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, he talked about Dutch. He talked about what it takes to build something for 30 years in the dark, without recognition, without the assurance that any of it will survive you. He talked about the particular kind of faith required to seal a tank and write a letter that begins, "For whoever," not a name, not a face, just the confidence that the world will produce the right person if you prepare for that person correctly and trust the preparation. He talked about the phone calls at midnight and the courthouse drives and the families that had been held together by a man whose name most of them never knew. He talked for about 10 minutes. Nobody said anything while he talked. At the end, he said, "Dutch always told me that a place is only as good as what it makes possible for other people. Not what it owns, not what it charges, what it makes possible." He looked at Cole when he said it. Cole held his gaze and nodded once. And in the space of that nod, he thought about a storage unit on the east side of Grants Pass. He thought about $3 in a deed and a Tuesday morning at a diner counter. He thought about climbing down into the dark and finding what a man he had never met had spent 30 years preparing for someone he would never meet. He thought about the vote in the empty road, and the folded blanket, and the rinsed coffee mug, and the two words on a yellowed envelope, "For whoever." And he understood, standing in that lot with the lights strung overhead, and the generator humming, and the smell of grease still hanging in the air from the morning's work, that whoever had turned out to be him. Not because he was exceptional, not because Dutch had known his name or planned for him specifically, but because he had been paying attention when the signal came, and because when the signal came, he had followed it, and because when he found what was at the end of it, he had not asked whether he deserved it, but only what it required of him. That was the whole ceremony. 30 people in a back lot in October because a dead man had built something worth continuing, and a man who had lost everything had shown up to continue it. I want to tell you something about what I think when I think about Dutch Calhoun, because I've been thinking about him for a long time since I first heard the story, and I've never fully found the words for what he represents to me, but I want to try. What Dutch did for 30 years is not heroic in any way that headlines would recognize. He didn't risk his life. He didn't make a dramatic sacrifice. He didn't overcome a single catastrophic obstacle in a compressed period of time that makes for a satisfying narrative arc. What he did was smaller and more difficult than any of that. He showed up. Every day for 30 years, he made a decision to be useful rather than visible, to keep a record of things nobody was asking him to record, to prepare for futures he would never see, to trust that the world would eventually produce the right person to carry what he'd built, and to do the preparation that trust required rather than just holding the belief and hoping. Most people cannot operate that way. I want to be honest about that rather than pretending it's ordinary. Most people need to see the result before they're willing to keep working toward it. Need someone to acknowledge what they're building before they're willing to keep building it. Need the feedback loop to stay closed. I do this. I see it matter. I continue. That's not a failing. It's how we're built. The feedback loop is not a design flaw. It's what makes most human effort sustainable. Dutch ran without that loop for 30 years, And the reason he didn't need the feedback to close back to him was that he had settled somewhere early in his life the question of what he was for. He wasn't building a legacy. He wasn't accumulating moral credit. He was doing what needed to be done because it needed to be done, and the needing was sufficient. Not the reward, not the recognition, the needing. I've thought about whether most people can learn to be that way, or whether it's something you either have or don't. I don't have an answer. What I know is that when you encounter someone who operates from that place, when you see the evidence of it in a ledger, in a sealed tank, in a letter addressed to whoever, it changes the way you understand what's possible. Not for everyone, not easily, but for the person who finds it, who climbs down into the dark and comes back up with 30 years of quiet evidence that a man can be useful without needing to be seen. It's a reckoning with what you've been settling for and what you might still become. Cole understood that. Eventually. You can see it in the way he runs the garage, the way he watches the people who come through, not managing them, watching, seeing what they need before they say it. The same way Dutch must have watched him once years ago on a road he can barely place in memory and seen something worth preparing for. And he got it right about Cole. That's the thing that stays with me. Dutch watched one moment on one road and made a judgment that held across more than a decade. He didn't get lucky. He was careful. He paid attention. He trusted what he saw. And the thing he saw was not a great man in a great moment. It was an ordinary man doing the obvious right thing on an ordinary night when nobody was watching and nothing was at stake except the integrity of the act itself. That's what Dutch was looking for, not greatness. Integrity in the small moments, the unremarkable ones, the ones that don't make it into anyone's account of themselves because they seem too minor to mention. Cole still works the morning shift himself, every day. Opens the bay at 7, makes the coffee, checks the workboard. He locks up at night and walks the perimeter and turns off the light above the back door. Same as Dutch did, every single night. The last time anyone in a position to know gave an account of the station, the float had helped over 60 families. Garrett was running the floor. Wren was doing diagnostics faster than anyone else in the building and was talking about instructor certification so she could teach what she had learned to the next person who showed up asking if they could learn how an engine worked. Birchlander's food pantry was feeding people every week in a small town near the California border. And on the wall of the back room, between the frame page from Dutch's ledger and the pin page from Cole's notebook, someone had added a third sheet of paper. Unframed. No signature. Just 2 lines in plain handwriting. The first line said, "Dutch built it." The second line said, "Cole kept it moving." I think about those 2 lines a lot, about the compression in them. 2 sentences that hold 30 years on one side and 3 years on the other, and all the people in between. The 63 families who received envelopes, the 68 families who received help from the float, Garrett and his 2 apprentices, Wren and her certification Birch, in his pantry, and whoever Birch has helped since. All of it distilled to 11 words on a piece of paper pinned without a frame to a wall in the back room of a garage on a road most people stopped using 20 years ago. Dutch built it. Cole kept it moving. Those 2 sentences are also in the most condensed form I can offer the whole of what I've been trying to say for the entire length of the story. Building something is one kind of act. Keeping it moving is another. The building requires vision and patience and the willingness to work in the dark without confirmation. The keeping requires something different. The willingness to receive what someone else built, to understand it well enough to honor it, and to carry it forward, not because you designed it, but because it deserves to continue, and you are the person who showed up. Neither is less than the other. They're different skills, different callings. Dutch had one, Cole had the other. And by some combination of preparation and signal, and a man following a word overheard at a diner counter, they found each other across the distance of decades in the barrier of death. 3 men, Dutch Calhern, who built something in the dark for 30 years and never needed anyone to see it. Cal Morrow, who drove past a locked building every few months for 11 years, because a man he trusted had told him the right person would eventually come. And Cole Vander, who lost everything he had built his life around and followed the only signal he had to a $3 deed and a dead man's unfinished work. Three men the world had written off. And between the three of them, something that is still standing, still running, still finding the next person who needs somewhere to land. That is the whole story, every word of it. Some things don't need to be explained. They just need to be continued.